Last week we started a new unit called Things I Wish Jesus Had Never Said. And in this morning's lesson, Jesus says some things that are so ridiculous that they make you wonder whether or not real biblical Christianity might not be a very bad idea indeed. In Matthew chapter 5 and verse 33, Jesus says, "You have heard that it was said to the people long ago, 'Do not break your oath, but fulfill to the Lord the vows that you have made.'" Now, when we talk about making an oath in this sentence, we're talking about a legal, formally binding pledge to do something. And those pledges come from the uttermost antiquity of our species. Very early on in the evolution of language, we realized that words can be both true and false, sincere and insincere. And so therefore, when you tell me something, I have no way of measuring the truth of what you say, which is particularly problematic in a commercial context. So let's say, for example, that I'm a wholesaler of stone tools in the late Neolithic era, and you approach me and ask me to supply you with 100 flint spearheads so that your tribe can go hunt woolly mammoths. And I say, fair enough, I have such a supply in stock, what are you going to give me? And you say, I will give you every month 1 mammoth skin and 100 pounds of mammoth meat so you can make mammoth burgers for your mammoth belly. And okay, I'm happy, you're happy, we're all happy, but how do I know that you will do what you say you will do? How do I know that you are a person of your word? I don't. One of the weaknesses of human language is that it carries no guarantee of authenticity. And so what I get you to do, it's the Stone Age, we're all superstitious. I get you to swear on the gods, particularly the scary ones, and your oath will go something like this. I swear by the great eagle god in the sky, the one with the pointy beak and the sharp talons, that I will pay you what I said I will pay you. And if I don't, may the great eagle god descend from the sky and poke out my eyes and devour my flesh, something like that. So in the ancient world, making an oath was a way of upping the ante on human language. It contained curses and consequences that would befall the oath giver if he proved not to be a person of his word. So in the superstitious cultures of the ancient world, saying "I cross my heart and hope to die" was just a way of life. And the Bible accepts this. In the early parts of the Old Testament, it actually says, "Fear the Lord and make your vows in his name." Swear to God and then promise that you'll do what it is you've sworn. So when Jesus says, "You've heard that it was said," he's talking about something that everyone accepted was part of life. Everyone made these kinds of contracts. And in Jesus' day, this habit of swearing, of making some kind of contract, was heavily regulated. For example, in the Mishnah, this is a first century Jewish legal book, there's an entire section on taking oaths. And what's interesting about that section in the Mishnah is it highlights what oaths are binding and what ones are non-binding. For example, one rabbi says, if you say that you'll pay your invoice at the end of 30 days and you swear by Jerusalem, that's not binding. But if you swear towards Jerusalem, that is binding. Makes sense? Today we call this the small print. And in Jesus' day, even the most straightforward of contracts, the most simple of negotiations, was awash with this kind of contractual nonsense. Does this sound like any culture you know? You get some service on your cable package, you get a new cell phone, and you're handed this thing, and you didn't realize that you should have taken a magnifying glass into the store. You didn't realize that getting this simple thing would mean you'd have to read a novel's worth of of words, and it's annoying and it's frustrating. And in this context, Jesus says, that's the way it was, that's the way it is. Next sentence, but I tell you, do not swear an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is God's throne, or by the earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. Do not swear by your head, for you cannot even make one white hair black. The ladies would disagree. All you need to say is simply yes or no. Anything beyond this comes from the devil. But it's a bit extreme, is it not, Jesus? And in its first century context, and most certainly in our 21st century context, what Jesus says here is absolutely ridiculous. I could have easily skipped over this bit of the Bible. Jesus could have easily not said it at all, because you have no intentions of applying this to your everyday life, and that's been the position of the church since the 4th century. The fact is, you do sign contracts all the time. You sign them with your bank, with your cable provider, with your employees, with your customers. And the fact is that in certain circumstances in this world, you have to sign an oath and swear that your words are true. And in those scenarios, your word and their word, it isn't good enough. It has to be put on paper. There has to be witnesses. That's how the world is. And that's how the world was when Jesus said what he said here. So what does he mean? This, remember, is the Bible. And sometimes the Bible doesn't confirm your worldview. It doesn't stand before you and say everything you think is correct and everything you're doing is fine. Sometimes the Bible says hard things that challenge everything that you accept. And this is one of those occasions. Jesus is saying here that there's no need for you to swear by God that something is true. If you believe that God is real, then you must further believe that God is everywhere all of the time. And if you believe that God is everywhere all of the time, that means your language should be true all of the time. And this, to all but the most deluded of us, is surely worrying, because we all tell lies. We all embellish. We tailor, we fit our language to suit our circumstances. In fact, being less than truthful all of the time is a life skill, right? No? Okay, fine. Of course your bum doesn't look big in that. Of course it doesn't. No, really it doesn't. Abs, I wouldn't want you to have abs. I think abs are so unattractive. Your middle-age spread, I think it's amazing. Absolutely, your grey hair looks distinguished. I like bald men. It's great. It's fantastic. No, I didn't want the last cookie. No, of course I didn't. Not at all. No, I don't mind your issues. They're okay. It's fine. I love you the way you are. Am I right or are you right? I'm right. And here's another thing I wish Jesus hadn't said. Be all true all of the time. Be so comfortable in your own skin that you don't have to embellish. You don't have to tailor your words and your nuances to fit your circumstances. You can just say what you mean, and you can mean what you say. No need to constantly look for approval or acceptance in the twisting of your vocabulary. You can just be real as the God in whom you say you believe. And while his audience are struggling with the weirdness of that, he takes them further through the looking glass. He says, "You have heard that it was said, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. So once again, the reason that Jesus says, "You have heard it said," is because these people heard it said a lot. This sentence reflects one of the earliest developments in human justice. Have a look at this next slide. This is a thing called the Stela of a name I can't say without stuttering. Hammurabi, Babylonian king. Very important pieces of writing in human history. In fact, it's one of the earliest pieces of writing that we know about. Comes from about 1800 BC, so very, very early, much earlier than the Bible, early to middle Bronze Age. In other words, this piece of writing comes from a time when our ancestors lived in small clans and tribes. And this concept of eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, was first written in this early legal document. And when Hammurabi came up with this law, what he was doing was putting a limit on human vengeance. And it was a great development in the evolution of our species, because one of the blights in ancient societies was a thing called the blood feud. It would work something like this. My brother would steal an apple from your orchard, and you would be so outraged by what my brother did that you would chop my brother's hand off to set an example to other would-be fruit larcenists. And then I would be so outraged by the way you treated my brother that I would find you in the dark and I would cut off your head, as an example to anyone else who would chop off my other sibling's hands for stealing an apple. And then your family would be so outraged by what I did to you that they would come and they would kill me and my brother. And then my tribe, when they heard about what you did to me and my brother, would go to war and they would kill your entire village. And on the anger and the vengeance would go for generations. And this law, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, was designed by Hammurabi to put a limit on vengeance. In legal terms, we call this lex talionis, the principle that the punishment should only fit the crime. And this idea was incorporated into the Bible years later. Moses thought it was fantastic. He improved upon it, and it subsequently found its way into every civilized society, including our own. You perhaps remember that the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms says that everyone has the right not to be subject to cruel and unusual punishment. This is why when a friendly police officer pulls you over for speeding, you get a ticket and not an execution. Now, although the principle of eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth was written originally to restrict vengeance, very early on, people saw it as an excuse for vengeance. The Greek scholar Xenophon said famously that to take vengeance on one's enemies is nobler than to come to terms with them. It sounds almost manly, doesn't it? If you wrong me, I have this right to wrong you back. And that's how this was read. And you get the manliness of this text, don't you? You get how it can get out of hand, and this is how it was in Jesus' day. Shylock said it well in Merchant of Venice. Prick us, do we not bleed? Tickle us, do we not laugh? Wrong us, do we not seek vengeance? To take action when someone wrongs you is not only permissible in this early biblical thought, it is obligatory. Not to extract vengeance on the person who has done you wrong is to say that the wrong they did you is okay. It was acceptable, and you must not stand for it. That's how everyone read this text in Jesus' time. And look at what Jesus says next. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. I'm not even making that up. That's actually what he said. And I so wish he hadn't said it. Let's say that you're a Jew living in Germany and it's the morning after Kristallnacht. 1,000 synagogues have just been burned. 7,000 Jewish businesses have just been destroyed. 30,000 of your people have just been placed in concentration camps. How do you read this saying of Jesus. Let's say that you're a black man living in Alabama and it's the 1950s and there's a fiery cross burning outside your house and the Klan are coming for you and your family. How do you read this saying of Jesus? Let's say that you're being sexually abused or mugged or violently wronged in some way. How do you read this saying of Jesus? Is the Christian thing to do to let evil take its course? Many Christians have thought so. Tolstoy famously said that even to have soldiers and policemen and judges is unchristian because these things by definition resist evil, and Jesus said we are not to do that. Gandhi was very influenced by this particular saying of Jesus. This line in the Bible, if nothing else, makes you think. And sooner or later when you try to follow Jesus, you have to think long and hard about what he did and did not say. And as we try to do that, Jesus steps into our thoughts and goes on to give us 4 examples of what he means when he says, do not resist an evil person. Example number 1, if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other also. Okay, so when Jesus talks about a person's cheek here, a person's face, he's not talking about the thing on the front of their head. He's talking about a person's face as in their sense of prestige. And in the cultures of the East, and I think this is true in the Italian culture that many of you come from, respect is very important. In those cultures, one of the worst things that can happen to you is for you to lose face, for you to lose respect. And what Jesus is talking about here is someone slapping you. Notice he says specifically, on the right cheek. Now if I'm right-handed, and everyone in the ancient world, with minor exceptions, was, the left hand was thought to be dirty. If I'm right-handed, the only way I can hit you on the right cheek is by slapping you with the back of my hand. And in the ancient world, to slap someone with the back of your hand was to offer them the lowest form of insult. So much so that if that ended up in court, you would get double damages because your respect had been assaulted so much. To slap someone with the back of your hand was to say, if you were a man, I'd punch you in the face. If you were a man, I'd headbutt you and break your nose. But you're not a man, so I'll slap you with the back of my hand. It was a degrading, humiliating insult. Now, in a culture that values respect, in a culture that says your face is very important, you have a right not to be humiliated. You have a right not to lose respect. And I'm sorry, Jesus, but rights matter. For all sorts of reasons, I think it actually matters that you reserve the right not to be humiliated, that you reserve the right not to be mistreated. And yet the bizarre, the irresponsible, the absurd advice of Jesus is take the offense, take the disrespect. Example number 2, Jesus doesn't even give you time to think about it. He doesn't even tell you why. He just goes straight on to the next thing. Next thing, if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. In Jesus' first century world, people only owned 2 pieces of clothing. They owned a shirt, which was like a long undergarment, the kind of thing your grandparents used to wear to bed, and that was worn next to the skin. And then they had a thicker, warmer blanket type thing, a coat that doubled up as a blanket of a night time. And that coat stroke blanket was so important in their culture that it was legally protected in law. It was beyond the reach of any lawsuit of any debtor. And so the scenario here is some guy is in a small claims court and he's being sued for the shirt off his back. The shirt in law is fair game, but the coat, the blanket, is untouchable. However, the advice that Jesus gives here is rather than maintain your legal rights and hanging on to your coat, why don't you give them that thing as well? Now think about that for a second. If I have two pieces of clothing, I have a shirt and I have a coat, and I give you both of them, what does that leave me? Naked. And in the cultures of the East, to be naked is inherently humiliating. It is to face public embarrassment of the worst kind. So what Jesus thus far is saying is that when your dignity is assaulted, not only should you resist the delicious thought of revenge, but you should in fact indulge the very one who is assaulting you. In a culture obsessed with face and respect and prestige, you should be so secure in your own skin, you should be so enamored with what God thinks of you, that you give almost no thought to what society thinks of you. And again, I'm sorry, Jesus, but I wish you didn't say this. Again, I find myself being contrarian and saying, Jesus, this is irresponsible. You have a right not to be humiliated. You have a right not to be taken advantage of. You have a right, an important right, a right won over many centuries, to defend yourself in court against those who would wrong you. And yet the advice of Jesus stands in our face and says what you think is wrong, it's the opposite. Example number 3, if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2. So Jesus is speaking this in the first century, as you know, and he's speaking this to Jews. And Jews in the first century are under Roman law. The Romans are occupying their country, and they're subject to Roman law. And the Romans had a law that said you could force someone to carry your stuff for up to 1 mile. So this was one of the most hated laws in first century Israel. There you were, a first century Jew, and you're just doing your thing. You're in your driveway fixing your car, you're mowing your lawn, you're on your way to an important appointment. And some Roman soldier, any Roman soldier, could tap you on the shoulder and say, hey, Jew boy, carry my backpack for 1 mile, and you would be forced to do this. This word forced is used elsewhere in the Gospels. Remember where Jesus is carrying the cross and it's a bit difficult, and the Romans forced this guy called Simon to carry it for him. This is law in Israel, and it's hated. It's a daily reminder of the Roman occupation and of how much they hate these people. And so whenever they were forced to carry something for Romans, they would count the steps. A Roman mile was 1,000 paces. And so they would say to this Roman soldier, fine. It's that bitter tone of voice sometimes that you acquiesce to your partner or your friend or your boss. Right, I'll do it. And they would count 1, 2, 3, 99, 999, 1,000. There you go, there's your stinking backpack. I won't do it anymore. And this example that Jesus uses is about the little people. It's the little people who get abused. It's the little people who get wronged in court. It's the little people who get slapped in the face. And again, I got to object to what Jesus says. I think it matters that we not allow ourselves to be bullied and oppressed, that we stand up for our rights. And yet the advice of Jesus is that we cooperate with the people who wrong us. Example number 4. I'm glad there's only 4. I was done at 1. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. Now, this is awkward, isn't it? Because when a person asks to borrow from you, it's your right to say yes or no. And if you feel that that person is taking advantage of you, then you are most certainly within your rights to say no. And yet the bizarre, the otherworldly, the irresponsible advice of Jesus is just to give to whoever. Just give. Someone asks, give. Don't even think about it. Don't pause for a second to consider the legitimacy or the authenticity of their need. I used to get visits, not anymore because I don't have an office, but I used to get visits when I had an office. About once every 6 months this guy would come, and it was the same guy but always in a different uniform. So sometimes he was a pilot, sometimes he was a fireman, sometimes he was a painter and decorator, and he always had some sort of uniform that he got in Value Village or whatever, and he always had some story. He needed money to get to his plane, or money to get, to get his paint out of the locker, or money to get, to the fire station because there was a fire. So, and his story was awesome all the time, and I never ever gave him anything because I felt that was right. I felt to give would be irresponsible in a situation like that, and yet Jesus seems to advocate irresponsibility here. And you know what? When I read these sentences that Jesus said, these things I wish he'd never said, the thing that's missing for me in all of them is the punchline. Right? He never says why. And I would find it really helpful if having to conduct myself so submissively, if having to so willingly become the quarry of those who would take advantage of me and trample on my rights, I would at least be given the courtesy of a why. I would at least get some Gandhi-esque logic that tells me it would work out in the end. That eventually I would win, even though it always felt like I was losing. I would at least have liked that from Jesus. But the cold reality, of course, is that when you give your rights to others, they will only too gladly trample on them. When you make yourself submissive, people will all too readily make you submit even further. So what is this? What is this thing that Jesus is saying? Where's he coming from with this horrible wisdom that is not wise? I think this isn't a list of rules. This isn't something that I think is to be taken literally. Christian history would suggest that's not the case. I think what Jesus is doing here is he is asking his followers just to think. He is stirring it up deliberately. He's reaching his contrarian spoon into their brain and he's mixing it up. And what he wants you and me to think about is what it's actually like to live in the kingdom of God. What it really means for us to be Jesus followers in this horrible world that we sometimes find horrible. And maybe those thoughts revolve around our sense of self. The life that Jesus describes here is, if nothing else, dead to its own sense of self and dignity. The life that Jesus describes here does not care when it is wronged, when it is insulted, when it is offended, when it is ill-treated. It seems to care about something higher. It seems to behave as though its home is not of this world. And that is the bizarre question that these bizarre, horrible sayings of Jesus ask of us. We say in our faith and in our songs and in our prayers that we believe in heaven and in the life to come. Why, therefore, are we so invested in the detail of the life that we live? We say that that matters, but we behave as though this matters. And that hurts. That question is difficult. And Jesus just leaves it lingering. He wants us to think about it by saying these horrible things. Good luck with your thoughts, and I hope you wish me well. Good luck. Any questions on any of that?